Hi, today we're very happy to have Mr. Peter Walk to join us to have a conversation and dialogue about lots of issues. And so now let me give Peter the chance to introduce himself about his work experience and his background.
Let me just start with my interest in China, which has been pretty high for probably 40 years. So I studied biographies of a lot of my favorite people, so composers, authors, etc. So I got to develop a better understanding of the East versus the West. I think Western philosophies and religions are what I would call dualistic by nature. So they're inherently judgmental. So you have good, bad, heaven, hell, etc.
Is that mostly influenced by this Christianity?
Yes, very influenced by Jewish and Christian faith. And I just didn't find that very appealing. I don't like the idea that people are constantly looking for winners and losers. So when I studied the Eastern religions, and I started with Buddhism and Hinduism, I like very much the idea of harmony and balance. So I just said, I'm just basically an Easterner in a Western body. When I hit 60, I told my assistant I wanted to go to China every 6 to 8 weeks for a week.
So when was that? Which year?
That started probably 15 years ago. But I made over 80 trips to China because my field at McKinsey was insurance. So I was advising large insurance companies around the world.
So around the early 2000. So that was your first trip to China?
Yeah, first trips.
And,
well, I did some earlier trips when China was all bicycles, no cars.
Oh, in the 80s?
Yes, in the 80s and early 90s. But this was the first time I really spent dedicated time in China. And I wound up writing a book because I got so tired of reading in the Western press about the oppressive, corrupt government and the unhappy, oppressed people. And I said to myself, I've made over 80 trips. How come I've never met any of these unhappy, oppressed people?
But you travel to both the cities and the rural areas?
Yeah, but I'd say probably 75% would have been big cities.
Big cities,
most of the other time I was here for pleasure with my family, with my kids, and yeah. So, but I developed a pretty good feel for China overall. So I wrote a book that largely examines the real differences between the U.S. and China, because the U.S. is always saying our model is the only right model, that ultimately everyone is going to become a democracy. By the way, I don't believe that at all. So the US is an individualistic model, going back to escaping Europe. China is very much a collective model. US has a relatively, they don't like to hear these words, a relatively weak government by design. So when the founding fathers developed the Constitution in the US, they basically said, let's do everything we can to minimize what the government is allowed to do, because this should be a country of, by, and for the people. And China, on the other hand, had a very strong central government, has going back thousands of years. It's always had that. In part, I think, because people need to come together to protect against the invasions from the north. And then also the number of catastrophes, weather catastrophes, that required people to come together to kind of rebuild. So the model was very much...
So the U.S. seems to have a natural national border, so it's much safer.
Yes, totally.
China surrounding.
Yeah, we had no equivalence. I mean, when settlers arrived in the U.S., the country was basically owned by Indians, who were relatively unsophisticated, and the U.S. in a not very nice way basically
but it seems
forced them out.
The U.S. president, in the time of emergency, for example, perhaps also has a lot of power.
Yes.
And the Congress can also, set up new laws to overrule, the old ones, in a time of emergency, maybe. So that makes the U.S. quite flexible in dealing with crisis, and also during peaceful time, maybe governments try to minimize the size.
But there is one very significant difference is the best and the brightest young people in the U.S. almost always go into business.
Go to business.
They do not go into government. They view as the government.
Law and the
yes.
medical field.
Yeah.
Because that's where you make make a lot of money.
Make a lot of money.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the best and the brightest, going back to the Mandarin tradition in China, generally went into public service and government.
Right, yes.
But the net effect is, if I think about the people I've met in the Chinese government, they are highly educated. They tend to be pretty worldly and have had jobs in different sectors.
But how would you compare this kind of U.S. system with European countries? Because, the whole process we call, so-called modern civilization, whether that be scientific revolution or industrial revolution, they actually started in Europe. But how the European countries' political system differ from the U.S. or they're similar?
They're similar in the sense that they're both democracies. So you rely on votes to select your leaders.
But their democracy come much later, right? Starting in the 18th century, 19th century, none of the European country was a democrat. Had a democracy. Right? It was under monarchy mostly.
Yeah, and you also had, Europe was a very deeply ingrained class system. Whereas the U.S. from the very beginning was not a class system. I mean, the purpose was equal opportunity for everyone because they were escaping Europe, which was a class system.
Right.
But I think the economies evolved in fairly similar ways. I think the difference in the U.S. is the U.S. relied very much on immigration for creativity. So a lot of the great inventions, discoveries, they came out of America, really can be traced back to Europeans who emigrated to the United States, frequently because they wanted to escape oppression.
Seems from the Chinese point of view, when I talk to lots of Chinese, whether they're from different background, when they talk about the U.S., it seems they have a much bigger picture in their mind. They talk about the West, and they know that the rise of the West started in Europe. So therefore, they like to compare what's the major difference between Europe and China. Then starting from there, they move to what's the major difference between U.S. and China. So therefore, I would like to know from your point of view, if you compare Europe with China and compare Europe with the U.S., what kind of major difference in terms of whether that be political system or institutions or some other background you see? The contrast between U.S. and China seems much striking larger. But if you compare Europe and China, especially in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century when Europe rose up, maybe the difference was different, or different type of difference. How would you see that?
Well, I mean, obviously there wasn't that much interaction between the Europeans and China until the Opium Wars in the 19th century. And I think, especially Great Britain, which kind of took the lead, I think that created a pretty high level of tension between China and the Europeans. I think the Americans played a role in the Opium Wars, but it wasn't a dramatic role. And I think I'd say the Europeans in general were more aggressive.
Also, they seems their government had more centralized power. To facilitate industrialization, that's why First World War, Second World War took place among those European countries.
Well, I think, to me, the main thing that happened in the 19th century is that China missed the Industrial Revolution.
That's a very interesting point.
So you had the Qing dynasty run by the Manchus, where frankly you have examples like Empress Xixi, who spent the treasury on rebuilding the Summer Palace as opposed to the Navy, which is what it was meant for. So I think the inward focus of the Manchus under the Qing dynasty led to a lack of interest in what was going on in the rest of the world and not any real intellectual curiosity. So when you had the Brits show up for the first time with, here are all of our discoveries and here's what's enabling us to modernize, the response from the Empress or Emperor at the time was very much, we have nothing to learn from the West.
I think that time China really was not aware or know very little about what's going on in Europe.
Exactly.
Otherwise, you think they might have behaved differently if they knew.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So if you think about Chinese history, if you missed the Industrial Revolution, which was really affecting most of the advanced Western countries, and the US and the UK probably played the prominent role.
Maybe that's also why historians often talk about, Germany used to be a backward area or nation, was not even unified. And until maybe late second half of 19th century, then Germany started to emerge as a power.
Yes.
So how could Germany do that, whereas other European nations like Poland, I don't know, failed to achieve that?
Yeah.
And also in Asia, Japan, came into place, and but people also talk about how come Japan succeeded in capturing the process of industrialization, whereas China keep falling behind.
If you take those two examples, I mean, what was the common denominator is both Germany and Japan were very anxious to build up their industrial might for military reasons. So Japan was very aggressive militarily vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Russia, and other areas. So I think once you start down that track, then you want to be able to build ships, you want to be able to build an army, you want to be able to build everything that goes with military might. And Germany, exactly the same.
Actually,
Germany was obviously a very major player in European wars in the late 19th century, and then very aggressive and active in World War I and World War II. So I think a lot in those two cases, the industrialization followed a military spin.